Alright, so in this video we're just going to talk about an overview of muscular tissue. And in general, muscle tissue accounts for nearly half of your body's mass. And one thing that's common among all the different types of muscle tissue is that they help to transform chemical energy in the form of ATP into more like directed mechanical energy, which is used to exert force through contraction. Now, when we look at muscles, we want to basically help to characterize them by their types. Other characteristics and functions of those muscle cells will also tell us about what those can do. Now, in terms of just generally talking about terminology here, myo, mes, and sarco are all prefixes for muscle. So we'll find that a lot of the terminology we talk about in this chapter contains these prefixes, but they'll just refer to muscle. And there are three major types of muscle tissue. We learned about this back in chapter 4, but essentially skeletal, cardiac, and smooth are the three major types of muscle tissue in the human body. Skeletal and cardiac are both striated, which means they have stripes. Smooth muscle tissue is not striated, and ultimately this relates to some of the molecular characteristics inside of these cells we'll talk about later. Now, only skeletal and smooth muscle cells are elongated and therefore also called muscle fibers. So a muscle fiber is just technically an elongated muscle cell. Now, skeletal muscle contains skeletal muscle tissue, which is packaged into small units called fascicles we'll talk about. And these are attached to bones and skin, hence the name skeletal muscle. Now, because these contain different types of connective tissues and blood vessels and nerves, we consider skeletal muscles an organ. And skeletal muscle fibers are some of the longest of all of your muscles because they can be up to feet in length. And these cells also have striations, which are stripes. Now, we call skeletal muscle voluntary muscle because it's consciously controlled, by your will. And these also contract rapidly, but tire easily, and are typically fairly powerful. Now, some of the key words for skeletal muscle are things like striated and voluntary. So when you think of striated voluntary muscle, that refers to skeletal muscle tissue. And when it attaches to bones, that's why it has a name. So cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the heart, and it makes up the bulk of your heart walls. Now, it's also striated, like skeletal muscle is. However, it's involuntary, which means we can't control cardiac muscle tissue consciously. Rather, cardiac muscle will contract at a steady rate due to your heart's own pacemaker electrical potentials, and your nervous system can increase the rate, but ultimately it's not under conscious control. And some of the keywords for cardiac muscle or cardiac, which refers to heart, it's also striated, but it's involuntary. Now, smooth muscle tissue is found in the walls of hollow organs, things like your gastrointestinal tract, your genitourinary tract, and your respiratory tract, as well as your blood vessels, all have smooth muscle within the walls. Now, smooth muscle is called this because it's not striated. In fact, you don't find those stripes in smooth muscle because it has a different molecular composition. And it's also involuntary, like cardiac, which means it can't be controlled consciously. So some smooth muscle can contract on its own without the nervous system to stimulate it. So just to look at the three types of muscle here, we have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Remember, skeletal is attached to bones, cardiac you find in your heart, and smooth muscle you find in the walls of hollow organs. Now, both skeletal and cardiac are striated, which you can see these little stripes here on the histology slides, whereas smooth does not have those striations. There are no stripes here. And ultimately it relates to what types of proteins and arrangement of proteins you find inside of these cells. Now, skeletal muscle cells are not branched, whereas cardiac muscle cells are, which gives the cardiac muscle tissue more of a disorganized appearance. And skeletal muscle cells, because they don't branch, are just sort of these long, elongated cells, which we call fibers. And because some skeletal muscle cells can be up to feet in length, they have many nuclei all along the length of the cell to basically help regulate little local areas of the cell. Now, cardiac muscle cells are shorter. In fact, they're so short we can't call them fibers like you would with skeletal and smooth muscle. And these cardiac muscle cells are all interconnected by big aggregations of gap junctions and desmosomes, which we call the intercalated discs. So if you look here, all these darker lines are intercalated discs, which are large aggregations of desmosomes to hold these cells together strongly, as well as gap junctions to allow for the spread of electrical currents from one cell to the next through those little protein tubes, which are the gap junctions. And the reason why this looks so disorganized, due to appearance, is that these cells are highly branched, and they'll typically branch into kind of Y-shaped patterns, which makes this tissue look more disorganized. And also, it has 1 to 2 nuclei per cardiac muscle cell, whereas skeletal muscle cells have many nuclei along their length. Smooth muscle is pretty easily identifiable, again, because you don't have striations, and you find smooth muscle in the walls of hollow organs. It's also under involuntary control, like cardiac muscle is, and its function is to help with propulsion of materials and regulation of flow and pressure in different areas of your body. Now, all muscle tissue shares these 4 major characteristics. So all muscle tissue is excitable, which means it's responsive, and it can receive and respond to stimuli. Stimuli can be electrical or chemical in nature. Now, contractility refers to muscle's ability to shorten forcibly when stimulated. And this is basically what muscle tissue does. All muscle tissue needs to be extensible as well, which means it has the ability to be stretched. So stretchability makes this tissue more dynamic, and it can actually move when your body moves. And elasticity refers to this tissue's ability to recoil back to a resting length. And this is important because when muscles contract and then they relax, you want them to be able to recoil back to their own resting shape. Now, other important functions of muscle include producing movement. Skeletal muscle could do this in terms of like walking. Otherwise, smooth muscle could be involved with digestion, or cardiac muscle is involved with like pumping blood. Now, other important functions include maintaining posture and body position, like skeletal muscle does that. Stabilizing joints, that's also another function of skeletal muscle. And generating heat as they contract. Again, skeletal muscle is the type of muscle that contracts during shivering to help produce heat to warm your body up. Now, additional functions of muscle could be things like protection, formation of valves, controlling the size of your pupil to regulate how much light can enter your eye, and also cause goosebumps, like in your skin.